Zionism in 20 minutes.
So,
Less discussion, more talking, unfortunately. Zionism, it has to be said, has been the most successful Jewishness movement in Jewish life. If you lived in Poland in 1910, you would have agreed with the Bund that Zionism was a crazy utopia, and Jewish socialism made a lot more sense, was a lot more plausible to see happening. Fast forward 100 years, Yiddish socialism is mostly nowhere, and Zionism has met its major goal. Its major goal was creating a Jewish state. That was achieved. Now, in talking about Zionism, I don't want to get into a history of the state. I certainly don't want to get into a political debate on the particular choices that particular governments have made and the conduct of this Jewish state. We can certainly talk about that at dinner, or afterwards, or later, or after that. The point here is to look at the origins of Zionism and the ideology as one of the possible sources of our sense of what it means to be a Jewish person and to be part of the Jewish nation. As I mentioned, in the 19th century, this European nationalism was burgeoning, and Zionism is in many ways a 19th century European nationalism. It accepts that a national group has the right to its own state. It has the right to use its own language, it has the right to articulate and create its own culture, and it has the right to do so with an ethnic self-determination. In fact, there are some who would say that their Zionism impels them to support Palestinian nationalism. Because they say if Zionism means ethnic groups get their own state, then the Palestinians should have their own state. And my support of Palestinianism is, in fact, a support of Zionist ideology. So, at its essence, that was the Zionist articulation, but it doesn't appear in a vacuum. Herzl didn't invent this concept. It's part and parcel of European ethnic nationalism from the late 19th century. And we have to also remember that this doesn't emerge in a vacuum. In the 1860s, we saw Gordon's poem where he said, "The Russians are welcoming you. They want to be your brother. Everything will be wonderful." And a lot of Jewish socialists involved in international socialism in the 1860s and 70s had this optimistic future in mind. In 1881, the Tsar was assassinated, and one Jew was involved in the plot out of several people. The Jews were blamed for the death of the Tsar, and a series of massive pogroms broke out across the Russian Pale of Settlement. And the socialists cheered. They cheered because they said, "Look, the masses can be mobilized." And the Jewish socialists said, "What? That's my bubby you're talking. I mean, what do you mean?" And many of them were disillusioned with that international socialism and began to return to a kind of ethnic Jewish identity and begin to say, you know what? This universal identity might not work. They began to experience national oppression and came to a national solution in response. And the same was true for this new anti-Semitism that emerges. We think about the Dreyfus trial in France in the 1890s. Captain Alfred Dreyfus was a captain in the French army. He had achieved. He was not a lieutenant, he was not a private, he was a captain in the army. And yet, he was blamed for the French defeat to the German army in the 1870 war, and he was sent to Devil's Island on trumped-up evidence, and ultimately exonerated after a long and difficult battle in public opinion and through the court system in France. But when Dreyfus was sent away and arrested, the crowds outside were yelling, "Down with the Jews! Down with the Jews!" Now, witnessing this trial was a journalist from Vienna, very assimilated, unclear if he ever had a bar mitzvah. His name was Theodor Herzl. And yet, when he saw this in the heart of the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité, and they still say down with the Jews, he said, you know what? They're never going to let us in. I included here a short selection from his book, The Jewish State, which he wrote in response to the Dreyfus trial. We have honestly endeavored everywhere to merge ourselves in the social life of the surrounding communities and to preserve the faith of our fathers. That's the Reform integration, right? We are not permitted to do so. In vain are we loyal patriots. Our loyalty runs to extremes. In vain do we make the same sacrifice of life and property as our fellow citizens. In vain do we strive to increase the fame of our native land in science and art, or her wealth by trade and commerce. In countries where we have lived for centuries, we are still cried down as strangers. They won't let us in peace. They won't let us be citizens. And if they won't let us, why are we still fighting this losing battle? If in the end, the non-Jewish population will mark us as different, then we might as well leave and be different. Now, he wasn't the first person to come up with this idea. In 1881, after those pogroms, an Eastern European thinker named Leo Pinsker began to write a book published in 1882 called Auto-Emancipation. Auto-emancipation means free yourself, right? So in 1882, he said, we need to make our own state, we need to get out of here, we need to leave. And in response to those pogroms and that writing by Pinsker, there was a movement called the Bilu Movement, B-I-L-U, that began in 1881. Bilu was an acronym for a line from the Bible that says, Beit Yaakov lechu lecha, House of Jacob, let's get up and go. Enough. Now, they didn't have a full platform, they didn't have funding, they were idealists. They weren't even socialists. They went there to try to do what they could, and they were largely a failure. Many of them left, gave up. But after Herzl's writing of the Jewish state, after the continued experience of ethnic oppression in Eastern Europe and rejection in Western Europe, a World Zionist organization was formed in 1897, ironically the same year as the Bund. They began to develop a World Zionist Congress, a World Zionist organization that had a few objectives. One was to create a Jewish national fund to purchase land. Another was to create a colonial association to encourage people to move and settle there. Another one was to raise awareness of this movement across Jewish population centers. And they had some detours, they had some controversies. In 1903, for example, the British government proposed that they would give part of British East Africa, what was now known as Uganda, to the Jews and let them make a Jewish home there. And Herzl said, okay, we'll talk about it. He brought it to the World Zionist Congress, and people said, what? Uganda? East Africa? Zion or bust. They would accept no compromise. It's called Zionism, after all, after Mount Zion, which is in Jerusalem. No alternative. Yes, we want a refuge for Jewish suffering, which was Herzl's motivation, but we're not going to accept any refuge, but we'll only accept one refuge if it's in one place. Now, the basic Zionist analysis of the situation was the Jews are a territory without their own. They live among other nations, and in some ways they're kind of a ghost nation, because most nations have a territory. And the Jews, or at least live in a contiguous space. You know, the Ukrainians tend to be in Ukraine, right? The Poles are in Poland. Even if there wasn't a Poland, the Poles were where the Poles were. But the Jews are all over the place. And yet they still act like a nation. They're kind of a ghost nation without a body, and that bothers people. So the solution to that problem, and it isn't assimilation because that doesn't work, they keep kicking us out, must be to give them their own state. Now the question becomes, what do we do in the meantime? And how do we get there? So one strategy of how to get there was pray. Jews have been trying that for a long time. And hadn't been that effective. The second option was get up and go. And so a lot of Zionists went and moved. They moved when it was still the Ottoman Empire, they went and moved there. They founded collective farms and settlements because they were influenced by the socialist ideology that was very common at the time. They became socialist Zionists, also called labor Zionists. There were others who were motivated to get up and move, who had a more sort of capitalist orientation, and they were more, what do I say? The socialists tended to be very idealistic. Some were more rational, hard-headed about it, and also more willing to dispossess others, we'll put it that way. That's the beginning of what's called Revisionist Zionism, the ancestors of the Likud party, who said, look, it's a conflict between Jews and Arabs. There are lots of places for Arabs, there's no places for Jews, and so it's the consideration between hunger and starvation. We're starving, they're hungry, we win. And so we get to do what we need to do to take what we need to take. That was, by and large, a revisionist perspective. There were still others who thought they could create a Jewish state, but do it in a religious way, or at least to use the seculars making the state for an ultimate religious goal. That was called religious Zionism. They imagined that ultimately the Messianic aim would be fulfilled by the secular state being formed, and then ultimately all the Jews coming, and then in 1967, after the Six-Day War, that was their sign, they believed, that now the Messianic era is here. And so the religious settler movement largely sees its origins in religious Zionism dating back to the beginning of the Zionist movement. But there was another strain of Zionism called political Zionism. This is what Herzl tried to work on. What he wanted to get was a document from the large ruling powers that authorized a Jewish state in the land of Israel. And so he went to the Kaiser, and he went to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and they lobbied the British government, and they lobbied the French government. And the end result of this political Zionism was a document that came out in 1917 called the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration said that Her Majesty's government of England looked with favor upon the establishment in Palestine of a Jewish national home. And so here was a document from a world power that said, finally, the Jews have a right to a national ethnic home in the land of Israel. Now the challenge was that that document went through editing processes. And the initial version of that document was different. It said, Her Majesty's government looks with favor on the establishment of Palestine as the national Jewish home. So the first version said, it's all Jewish. The Jews get it all. And the later version that came out later said, the Jews get some of it. And there are some in the Jewish world today who still resent that compromise. Sometimes the land of Israel is called the thrice promised land, because during World War I you had the Balfour Declaration, which promised it to the Jews. You had a secret treaty between the French and the British called the Sykes-Picot Treaty, which divided it into spheres of influence between the British and the French. And you had a promise to the Arabs, think of Lawrence of Arabia, that they were also promised an Arab kingdom in the same territory. So it's the thrice promised land. And the British were trying to win the war. So they promised what they promised. And then, of course, after the war, they have to deal with it. So with the newly formed League of Nations, they form they get a mandate from that League of Nations to help build a Jewish home. So political Zionism does produce some results. It got a statement. It got the British government behind building a Jewish home, allowing Jewish immigration to the land, supporting Jewish purchase of land through the Jewish National Fund, and so on. But that wasn't all that Zionism did, because a lot of Jews didn't make it to Israel. So a lot of Zionism was about building a cultural national Jewish identity, reviving the Hebrew language as a daily language, organizing farmers and pioneers, even in diaspora, to envision moving to the land of Israel, youth movements as well, HaShomer HaTzair, the Young Guard, Habonim, the Builders, and so on. They also, by the way, had an ideological agenda, because they wanted to remake what it meant to be a Jew. Zionists talked a lot about the old Jew and the new Jew. Who was the old Jew? The old Jew was old, and religious, and weak, and passive, and bent, and spoke Yiddish, and lived in exile, and negotiated for his survival. The new Jew stood tall and proud, was strong, was productive, didn't make a second-hand living, but made things and grew things and worked on the land, fought back, knew who he was, spoke the modern language of Hebrew, and so on. And so this ideology of the new Jew had an impact far beyond those who chose to move to Israel. That Jew fights back image became vitally important for diaspora Jews in the aftermath of the founding of the State of Israel. So what I want to look at the last is the declaration of the establishment of the State of Israel. We don't really have time to go through it, unfortunately. We've got 5 minutes left. But what I will point out here is, if you look through this, they give a whole series of arguments for why they have a right to the land. It's what we've done. It's what's happened in the past. It's not because God gave it to us. There's nothing in this document that said God gave us this land, or the Bible says so. In fact, the only reference to the Bible is in the first paragraph, and I want to highlight it because it shows you how secular they were. They claim the land of Israel as the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here their spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped, and they started here. Here they first attained to statehood, created cultural values of national and universal significance, and gave to the world the eternal book of books. According to this, who wrote the Bible? The Jewish people. They gave it to the world. Not God, not Moses on Sinai, the Jewish people. So the founders of Israel were mostly secular Jews, not exclusively. There were religious Zionists and old-line Orthodox Jews living in the land, traditionalists, but large numbers of them were secular Jews. And their basis for claiming a state of Israel was a secular claim based on national identity, national rights, and the declarations of the United Nations. So you see on the next page, on the bottom of that page, on page 53, this right, as given by the UN, by the League of Nations, and so on, is the natural right of the Jewish people to be masters of their own fate, like all other nations, in their own sovereign state. It doesn't define borders, doesn't claim the Bible, it simply claims the national right of all other peoples. And you can see in the kind of state they envision, which is on the second page, it talks about actually a very good democratic state, developing the country for the benefit of all of its inhabitants, basing it on freedom, justice, and peace, as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. They haven't read the prophets recently, but it was a nice idea. Ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all inhabitants, irrespective of race, religion, or sex. It's even better than the U.S. Constitution, which doesn't have any anti-sex discrimination guarantees, and so on. Now, there are some pieces of this document, I have to say, that show a deep naivete. In the very early part of it, it points out that when they began immigrating, they made the deserts bloom, they revived the Hebrew language, and then this phrase echoes very poorly in modern post-colonial ears, bringing the blessings of progress to all the country's inhabitants. Oops. It's Jewish white man's burden here. That we're improving the land and it'll be so good for the natives, they'll just love us. Well, it doesn't often work out that way. And so the dilemma with Zionism for us today is that in its essence, we have a lot of connections with it. The idea that the Jews are a people, not a religious community. The idea that you can have a diversity of political perspectives under the umbrella of a Jewish peoplehood. And even diversity of secular perspectives. The revisionist Zionists were just as secular as the labor Zionists. But they had a very different understanding of how society should be organized and what the correct strategy should be to make a Jewish state. We connect to Hebrew as a language that can be used for modern purposes, not only for religious and reciting rote prayers. We love the message of don't wait for the Messiah, do it yourself. Don't wait and act if you need to change things. We also learned, by the way, the importance of having a long-term strategic plan, and vision, and organization. I mean, they had a plan, and they were able to enact that plan, and they kept it through many, many years of work and setbacks and so on. The same is true for us. If we want to be individualized secular Jews out there, we're going to lose out to people who get their act together and organize and work in a concerted fashion. We also find that a lot of the Israeli culture being made in Hebrew, both then and now, is still very secular. The Song of Peace that Yitzhak Rabin sang shortly before he was shot, in 1993 or 94. The Song of Peace says explicitly, sing the Song of Peace, do not whisper a prayer. Don't pray, do. Act. Say it out loud. Talk to people, not upwards. And theirs is an identity rooted in history. Again, it claims at the very beginning of their Declaration of Independence, we're here, specifically here, because this is where we started, this is where our roots are. And so for many secular and humanistic Jews, their sense of Jewish history is a core part of their Jewish identity. And so it is too for many Israelis. Obviously, we have differences with the state on a variety of topics, and some of us have different perspectives on that than others. And we're also dealing with an interesting dilemma. We live in diaspora. And there are plenty of secular Israelis who say, I totally dig it. I understand secular Jewish identity. No problem. As long as you're doing it in Hebrew here. But doing a secular Jewish identity in diaspora, in English, what is that? How does that work? You see, even the Yiddishists might make the same claim. Because for them, Yiddish language and living in a Jewish key was a core to their identity. And so too for secular Zionists. If we're doing it in English, and we don't have the resonance of quoting the Hebrew, of learning the letters in the same way that Yiddishists or Zionists did, This is the question of the thinning out and the watering down. Unless we do some Jewish language, is it going to work? Can you have a secular national identity with a language on it? That works all the time. In Italy, in France. Can you do it in another language, in another country? That's an open question. And I'll comment to you one last thing in the packet. On page 55 and 56 and 57, I included a couple examples of Israeli poetry and modern Jewish poetry, and you can see how they've drawn on the past in creative ways. One called A Song of Praise by Yehuda Amichai, of course, the Yehuda Levi poem we saw from Spain, going back even before. And one of my favorites is this last one on page 57 called The Jews by Yehuda Amichai, which connects to history and culture and myth and legend, and all of it becomes the context for his modern sense of the Jewish peoplehood. And that's something we'll be talking about tomorrow in the morning. So I commend those to read on your own as well.